Welcome to the Be Bold podcast. I'm Beth Whitman. If you're new here, welcome. The Be Bold podcast is where I feature conversations with women who have inspirational stories to share. These are women who are on the cutting edge. They are kicking butt in major ways and forging their own paths to success. They come from a wide range of backgrounds and find themselves in an equally wide range of stages in their lives. The one thread they have is that they are bold in what they do. They follow what they love and somehow create a lifestyle that supports that. It's when we hear stories about other people's success and triumph over obstacles that we become inspired. Really, it makes us feel like anything is possible. I personally believe that we all have the ability to become better versions of ourselves, and what I'm hoping is that you'll find pearls of wisdom in these conversations, just bits of information that inspire and motivate you. I'm hoping you'll hear something that makes you want to change and make choices in your life that ultimately makes you happier and more fulfilled. Please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play and leave a review. Those reviews actually help people find the podcast, and it helps us build our Be Bold community. Today's conversation is with pilot and author Erin Seidemann. Erin and I connected online years ago, probably right around the time her book Postcards from the Sky came out. I was intrigued by Erin because I know how rare it is for a woman to be a pilot. Women make up about 5% of licensed pilots, and that is so incredibly low. That's actually been the case since Amelia Earhart's time. Interestingly enough, as I was editing this, the History Channel released a photo said to be of Earhart and her navigator. And a new documentary hypothesizes that they were captured by the Japanese when their plane went down in 1937 and that they actually died in Japanese custody. I think it's a fascinating theory, and it's sad to think that she lived her final days as a prisoner, but it's almost gratifying to know that she may not have died in a plane crash. Anyway, the thing about this conversation with Erin is that for me, flying, like actually being a pilot, piloting a small aircraft is beyond my imagination and my interest. I'm afraid of flying in small planes, and I do it only because many times it's the only way to get to a destination like Molokai or many places in Papua New Guinea. But it doesn't mean I'm not petrified pretty much from the time I sit my butt down in the seat. I do things to try to calm myself, but I usually maintain some level of fear the entire time. I didn't go up in Erin's plane when we met in New Orleans, and although she has offered for that, she's offered me many times, and after this conversation with her, I'll likely take her up on the offer next time I'm there. I loved speaking with Erin because her hobby of flying wasn't something that came easy for her. She's prone to motion sickness, which she had to overcome, and she even had a health issue that she refused to let get in her way of getting licensed. Flying is expensive, but Erin also owns her own plane, and that's even more expensive, right? She realizes that she works to pay for her love of flying, and she has no problem with that. In short, her passion and desire for wanting to be a pilot superseded the obstacles in her way. And in this conversation, we talked a lot about the logistics of getting a license, the beauty of flying, and of buying a plane. And we also talked about women pilots going back to Amelia Earhart's time and how the first meeting of female pilots from around the world consisted of just 99 members. Now, that wasn't all the female pilots in the world, but it was all that they could muster up at the time to get together in one place. We talked about sexism amongst pilots and how she uses it for motivation rather than letting it get her angry. And these are just ignorant comments that are coming from male pilots. And ultimately, what I found most interesting about Erin and our conversation is that she pursued something I have so little knowledge about, but she makes it seem so attainable. For sure, getting a pilot's license and buying a plane are things not available to everyone. But you can apply her passion for flying to most any hobby or interest and realize that with unwavering determination, it's possible to pursue your love. With that, let's go to this week's conversation with Erin Seidemann. I'm in New Orleans, and I love New Orleans. It's kind of crazy because the healthy lifestyle that I tried to live doesn't work down here. But I still appreciate the fun and adventure that people have, and kind of the laissez les bon temps rouler, as they say, just this really fabulous way of life down here. And I'm with Erin Seidemann, and she's been gracious enough to come and meet with me and have a chat. Erin's a pilot, and that's what I think is just so amazing, because there are so few women pilots, and we're going to chat about that. Erin, thank you so much for coming today, because this is amazing, and I have so many questions, and I can't wait to hear your story.
Well, thank you for having me. This is quite an honor.
Yeah, you bet. So first, tell us the name of your book that came out last year, was it?
Yes, it's called Postcards from the Sky, Adventures of an Aviatrix.
Excellent. And your website?
My website is agirlandherplane.com.
I love that. And I'm going to link to both of those in the show notes, and we'll hear more about those as well. So let's start with what you do right now in terms of your flying career. Give us some background on that and kind of where you are at this given time.
Sure. I've been flying for about 13 or 14 years now. I have a commercial single engine and commercial multi-engine rating, also instrument rated, tail wheel endorsement. There's all kinds of these little add-ons that you can get as a pilot, and it is sort of like a drug. You always want more and more, faster, bigger, better.
So when you say commercial single engine and multi-engine, does that mean that you could fly a commercial flight for an airline, Southwest, United?
So for the airlines, you need a specific type rating in that airplane. So I'm not qualified to do those yet. But the commercial rating, what that gets you is that you can, quote unquote, fly for hire.
So you have endorsements and the ability to fly a number of different planes.
Yes.
And you own your plane.
I own a plane. Yes, I'm on plane number 2 now. It's a twin engine. It's a Piper Seneca.
How does one just own a plane?
Well, the big thing is money and really just time commitment to, keeping the plane in good shape. Planes don't like to sit around. Engines don't like to sit around. So you want to be able to fly it consistently. And have a good mechanic if you're not a mechanic yourself. So it's just time and money, like flying.
Probably like a boat, which I think more
Yes.
people could relate to having a boat. You don't want it just sitting in the dock, but it's
Right.
got to have some use. You work for hire, so you're bringing people up and you're transporting them to where?
Well, so there are all kinds of FAA regulations on what just an individual pilot can do for hire. So it is really limited, especially since I own my own plane, because there's even more rules about that. So, I can, for example, take people on a nice city tour of New Orleans, which is a great city to see from the air. I can do banner towing. I can do, just kind of, sightseeing flights. I can't technically fly somebody like from point A to point B, and have them pay for not only, my airplane and the fuel, but also my time. There's all kinds of regulations about that, because then they consider you a pilot for hire, and you have to have a commercial operating certificate for yourself and for the airplane for that. But like, for example, if I'm going to a big fly-in in Florida, like I did last month, they have a really big one in Lakeland, Florida.
What is a big fly-in?
A fly-in is just a gathering of pilots. You can fly in if you have your own plane. You can drive in if you live closer to there, but the two big ones really in the United States there's one in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and there's one in Lakeland, Florida. And hopefully this year I'll get to go to both, because I've already been to the one in Lakeland. And, so when you're going to those, you can share a ride, so you can have other pilots or even just other friends come with you, and they can split the fuel cost with you, but they can't pay you for your time. So it is a little frustrating, the regulations about that. Because you think, when I get my commercial rating, I can start flying all kinds of, places exciting, and that's not really the case.
And make some money back on
Right.
it, which is what I would think. Like, oh, that's great. You've got your commercial endorsement. That means you could charge people for
Right,
it, but
right.
technically you can't.
Yeah, and when I say I have my commercial rating, everybody says, "Oh, who do you fly for?" Well, nobody actually. I have my own plane.
Okay, and then do you have aspirations for getting other certificates or endorsements that will allow you to eventually charge people, or to take them to Houston, or to take them as far as your plane will allow?
I would like to keep getting other ratings. I mean, the whole reason for getting my commercial rating, even though I don't want to be a professional pilot, is just to keep becoming a better pilot. but I don't have aspirations to become a professional pilot because the starting pay is so bad. So, you sort of get used to, I work in finance, and you kind of get used to a certain lifestyle, and the lifestyle, especially that supports my airplane. And to me, that's the most important thing in my life right now, so I'll do anything to keep that. And unfortunately, if I took a job as a professional pilot, it's years until you're making decent money, so I would have to sell my plane, and that's just not going to happen.
So this is your hobby that is obviously your passion.
Yes.
That probably keeps you sane in your 9-to-5 job.
Yes, it's amazing the therapeutic effect that flying has. And all the pilots say that. They'll say, I just had the worst week, and all I had to do was just take a short flight, and everything's perfect now.
I want to know more about that, but first let's talk about your job in the financial world. Is it a 9-to-5 job? Is it what does your day look like?
So it's not exactly 9 to 5. It's quite a bit different from that. I work from 1 to 10 p.m. because technically in my job is a supervisory analyst. It's sort of a compliance role in equities research. So I read stock reports that the stock analysts write, and I'm reading it for compliance. I have 5 regulatory licenses that allow me to do this job. Most of the stock analysts are busy during market hours making phone calls and doing all their research on all the stocks that they cover. So it's once the stock market closes that things start to get busy, because then they have time to sit down and write their reports, and they have to go through a supervisory analyst before they're published. It's actually the night shift that's the busy shift. So I'm on that, and I work for a company out of Florida, and we cover 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. So we have supervisory analysts all over the world covering different shifts.
And you're 5 days a week?
I am 5 days a week, yes.
Doesn't that get in the way of you wanting to fly?
It gets terribly in the way of me wanting to fly. There's so many things that I wish, like, if I could just take today off, I could get there for the weekend. And sometimes I do take days off to go flying. It's pretty much that, and just other traveling is really the only thing that I take time off work for. But it's the job is so related to the busyness of the stock market that, once a quarter you have what's called earnings season, where all the companies that are on a calendar year quarter report their earnings. Every company that our stock analysts cover has a report written about it in the span of a month. And so 1 month every quarter is so busy that I can't take any vacation. And for somebody who loves to travel, I find that very limiting.
Oh, yeah, that's tough. When your job gets in the way of travel, or what I say is real life gets in the way of travel. The reality is that most people have to have a job and they have to make money, but that's what funds their travel. And it is really frustrating when that starts to get in the way of your hobby or something that you really enjoy doing.
It is totally frustrating, but then again, I do remind myself, like you said, that, well, if it weren't for this, there wouldn't be the travel or the airplane. So you do have to appreciate it for what it is.
How often do you get out?
I try to fly pretty much every weekend, unless the weather's bad. I do have an instrument rating, so I can fly through clouds or fog, but here in the South, when the weather's bad, it's usually a thunderstorm, and you don't want to be flying through those.
No, you don't, definitely. So how does that bring peace of mind to you when you mention that, pretty much all other pilots think like, okay, I've got this really stressful week. For me, somebody who knows nothing about sitting in the pilot seat, there's nothing that is potentially more stressful than to think that I have to sit down and have all of these controls in front of me and maybe have a passenger, maybe not, but then be flying at, 1,000 feet. How high are you flying?
When I fly, I'm usually sort of in the high single thousands, so 7,000, 8,000.
Okay. Yeah. There's nothing more stressful in my mind to then be responsible for myself in a plane. So how is that relaxing for you?
It comes in so many different ways. First of all, you're seeing this beautiful world that we live in from a completely different perspective. And, you can get just a taste of it on a commercial flight for just a few minutes, right when you take off and when you're coming into land. You'll see my perspective, where you can see detail on the ground. And you can see cool landmarks. Here around New Orleans, there's so much cool to see, the river and the lake and stuff like that everywhere. Every place has different terrain, different fascinating landmarks. So you see that, and that in itself is calming, because you know that you're one of the very few lucky enough to have this perspective of the world. And it's not only that, but it's also having to concentrate so much. You know, I mean, certain planes are easier to fly than others, but you still have to pay attention to what's going on. You're paying attention to, the engine instruments and where you are, because there are different airspaces, and different airspace has different requirements to fly through it. So, you can't just totally space out and just kind of not be paying attention to anything. But I think it's that requirement of concentration that makes you forget everything else. You can't be really thinking about work that much. You can't be thinking about a relationship or, whatever is going on in your life at the time. You're thinking about flying. You're thinking about what's going on in the airplane and where you are and what you're about to do. The expression is you always want to be ahead of the airplane. So you want to be thinking ahead to what's going to happen next, so that you're not, nothing takes you by surprise. And sure, there are certain things that'll happen if you have engine trouble or something like that will take you by surprise. But you try to always anticipate and even train for stuff like that in case it does happen.
How long are you up for it on any given flight?
I'll fly. My plane has a range of about 5 to 5.5 hours, but my bladder doesn't usually have that kind of range. So I'll usually fly, maybe 3.5 hours and stop to stretch my legs, go to the bathroom, get some fuel. So the plane has more endurance than I do.
So how far can you go? Let's say you're in New Orleans, and you had mentioned before we started recording that you were in Houston. How far can you go in that with your plane? Like, we know how far a commercial flight can go in 5.5 hours across country. But what about you? How far can you go?
Well, so my plane cruises at around 160 knots, which is almost 180 miles an hour. And for example, I could go from here to, let's say, the east coast of Florida before I would want to stop and fuel up. Like if I go down to the Bahamas, I'll kind of follow the coast around, and then I'll stop for fuel before I hop over to the Bahamas. So it does have a pretty good range. In Houston, for example, I go there about once every month or so. I go to the west side of Houston, so it is on the far side of the city, and it's a very large city. But it's just an exactly 2-hour flight from here to the west side of Houston.
Before you set off, before you even take off and leave the tarmac, do you know where you're going to stop to refuel? Like, do you have to file flight plans and let that airport know that you're coming in? Or can you be on your way and go, oh, you know what? I really got to go to the bathroom, or I want to take a break and just pull into an airport like you would a parking lot?
Yeah, most of the time, if you're flying along, let's say I want to fly from here to Miami, for example. But along the way, either I have to go to the bathroom or I have someone else who's not feeling well or whatever. You can amend where you're stopping. Certain airports, you have to call them once you get into their airspace to get permission to land. But even more airports than that don't have a control tower, and you just self-announce once you enter, a certain distance from the airport, and just let them know you're coming. So there was even one time I was coming back from the Bahamas, and the turbulence was so bad, right, sort of where the panhandle of Florida meets the, where it kind of turns. And the turbulence was so bad, and I had like a 20 or 30 knot headwind. I just said, I saw an airport out my right window, and I looked on the map to see where it was. And I'm like, I'm not going to make it to Tallahassee. I feel so bad. I'm just going to stop there. So I looked up what it was. I looked up the frequency to call. And I made the call. So, there is a lot of freedom in where you can stop, and you don't have to always file a flight plan ahead of time. The only time really that you have to file a flight plan is if you're going to be crossing, from the U.S. to international borders or water. Like if you're going to the Bahamas, you do have to be on a flight plan. If you're not, once you cross the border, they'll send up some fighters after you. So you want to try to avoid that.
Yeah, you do. So all of that stuff is laid out in a book or in some kind of documentation that you carry with you.
Yeah, you'll learn all those processes as you're getting your private pilot's license. That's the first license that you get, because they do want you to stay out of trouble, and there are different regulations for different airspace and different airports or different types of airspace. So you have to know, like for example, here in New Orleans, when you come in, you fly into Louis Armstrong International Airport. And that's what's called a Bravo airspace. And Bravo is kind of the most restrictive. Whereas where I fly out of, very close to here, right on Lake Pontchartrain, Lakefront Airport, is Delta airspace. And it does have a control tower, but it's less restrictive.
And Delta not meaning the airlines, but
Right.
as in...
Alpha, Bravo,
right.
Charlie, Delta. Yeah,
got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Would you consider, going back to the original question about just feeling relaxed and having to be super focused, would you consider that maybe, a lack of a better term, like a flow state, where you're just like, you hear about this a lot with rock climbers, let's say, where it's a life or death situation and they have to be super focused in what they're doing. And it could be a musician or an artist as well, where you're just so focused on what you're doing that kind of time passes, you're enjoying what you're doing, but you're very much in the moment.
Yeah, I think it is very much like that. And we even use what's called flows in aviation, because we have checklists. And a lot of the things on a checklist, they are there for a reason. You can't forget them or something will go wrong. Stuff for like emergencies or stuff that has to happen quickly will, there's so many things that you can't really remember them, but you'll do what's called a flow, and you'll just sort of develop, it's part muscle memory and part brain memory. You'll just you'll know what to touch, what to look at, what to do. And that way it becomes automatic, if something does go wrong. So there is that kind of concentration. And, hopefully most of your flying is not going to be a life or death situation. And that's what's fun about it. I think if it were that dangerous all the time, a lot of us wouldn't do it. And I tell people all the time that really flying is so much safer than driving to the airport. I mean, just yesterday when I came back from Houston, perfectly wonderful flight, totally safe. Between the airport and driving to my parents' house, I almost got hit 3 times. And I told my mom kind of worries about my flying. I told my mom, I'm like, Mom, if you're going to worry about something, worry about me driving either to the airport or from the airport. And so when I got to their house, I said, I wish I could get back in the sky because down here is where I feel dangerous.
Yeah, being in a car, I think there's a feeling of safety for sure, because we're in a container that we think that we have control over. And I'm just kind of talking through my own fears around flying. And I'm not super fearful, but I do have some fears around it. And I would love to continue this conversation down that path. When you're on a freeway or a side street, or you're walking, you're driving your car, there is some sense of control around that. When I have flown in small planes, it's terrifying to me. Maybe one step below terrifying. I'm not sure what that is, but it's not, I'm certainly not in a flow state thinking this is great. And I appreciate the beauty at 3,000 feet. But I don't appreciate the bumps and the headwinds and the turbulence that happens that you really feel that you're not going to feel in a car. So, and I think that's where it comes down to, is that you're not feeling all the elements. They're not so obvious, but when you get in a plane, it can be scary.
Yeah, here in New Orleans, though, I think it's a little different because we have such terrible streets. They're just full of potholes. And so when people come flying with me, if they are a little nervous about the turbulence, or, I wouldn't even call turbulence is pretty bad. You have to be really bumping around. A lot of what we get is just teeny little wind shear, just a little bump here and there.
What to you is a little bump might be
true. Yes,
might be turbulence to me.
But I tell them, I'm like, hey, it's just potholes in the sky. And that's really what it is. And that usually calms them down a little bit. They're like, oh, okay, I get it now.
Yeah, that's a good way to think of it. I went for a run this morning, and I was running down St. Charles on the sidewalk. Boy, I felt like I was on almost a roller coaster sometimes, or a skateboard ramp where I was having to go up and over and up and over. And I thought, just let me get back to the hotel safely because I could so easily trip. So I can totally identify with that correlation there with just being potholes in the sky. How did you get from the point of, and we'll still back up, but I'm curious as to, obviously you had this love for flying, you wanted to fly, and you were determined to fly. Was it unnerving, terrifying, petrifying, scary the first time you went up, and maybe the first time you flew by yourself, and then there was a turning point where it was like, oh yeah, okay, this is my flow state, or this is really just really very relaxing for me?
Yeah, well, my biggest problem was I get terrible motion sickness. And, people who know that about me are like, so wait, then why did you want to become a pilot? And, I get it in cars, I get it in planes, anything that moves, I get motion sickness. And it's awful. It's the worst feeling. One of those things that is so bad you wouldn't wish it on your worst enemy. Then you're like, so wait, somebody who gets motion sickness and then you wanted to become a pilot, not only become a pilot, I also flew aerobatics for a while. But it's different when you're the one who's doing it, the one who's in control. Like, I'll still get a little motion sick sometimes on an airplane if I'm sitting in the back of a commercial airliner and we go through some pretty bad turbulence. But when I'm up there and you're the one having to control it and you're the one dealing with it and sort of planning ahead, what if this happens or what if this happens, you can kind of slow down a little bit and that'll lessen the turbulence a little bit. So there are some ways to deal with it. But when you're the one who's in control, I don't know why, I'm usually okay. It has to be really bad. It has to be extreme for me when I'm the pilot to want to land. Like I said, that example in Florida that was so bad. That was bad. It was so bad. It was my seatbelt was, I had a bruise from my seatbelt. That's how bad it was. So, you sort of get used to, I guess, being in control. And I think it is, I'm not a control freak, but there is a little bit of that, well, I do have some control over this situation, rather than sitting in the back of a commercial airliner and you're completely helpless and just kind of hoping that whoever's up front is dealing with it in the best way possible. So I wasn't so much terrified on my first flight lesson as motion sick. I was dating this guy at the time who was starting to take flying lessons, and that's what finally, I kind of joke with people that in order to take flying lessons, you need two things, time and money, kind of a lot of both. And, my life just hadn't been at a point yet where I had those. I was in school here in New Orleans first for undergraduate, and then I was in graduate school, ended up quitting graduate school. But I moved out to San Francisco. And this guy who I was dating at the time was taking flying lessons, and that was sort of what got the idea into my head then. When you're a kid, what kid doesn't want to fly or become an astronaut? So, I had those when I was a kid, but it was just never, within the realm of possibility. Until when I moved out to San Francisco and I had my first real job, then I did have the time and the money, and the guy who I was dating was taking lessons. And I went up with him just to kind of see what it was like. And I got completely airsick. I even had to ask them to stop the flight.
No.
It was that bad. And I felt bad because, it was one of his first lessons. But I couldn't go anymore. And when we landed, I thought to myself, why would somebody pay good money to do this? But I just noticed how much happier it was making him. And he was already a happy guy. It wasn't like he was, a grump all the time. He was already very happy. And it just took that happiness to the next level. And so I kind of gave it some time, and I thought, well, there really has to be something to this. So I gave it another try. And I guess something just clicked. Amelia Earhart, when she took her first flight, she said she knew then that she had to fly. Unfortunately, my path to flying was not as sure as hers was. But
fortunately.
Yeah, well, fortunately, I did find the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, fortunately, you have a better flight path than she did.
Oh, yes, that
ultimately,
too. Yes, yeah. I don't want to end up that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess when you do decide that you want to do something, and it was sort of the same for me with running. When I started running the first time, I was like, oh my God, why do people like this? Why do people want, this is torture in every way, mentally, physically. Why do people want to do this? And I don't know what happened between then and when I tried it again, and it clicked, and now I can't live without running, the same as now I can't live without flying.
So what does happen? Let's stick to flying, and then we could maybe get into the running thing too, because that's something that definitely we have in common. What did happen? Was it just that you saw like the happiness in this boyfriend, and you thought, yeah, I want some of that too. Let me see how I can get over the challenges and figure it out. Or what was the path that ultimately brought you around?
I think it was more, just on that first flight, really the second that you take off and you realize, oh my God, we are off the ground. There goes the ground. Okay. And then you look around for a second and you just take it all in. And it's just so amazingly beautiful. there's the noise of the engine, there's the instructor saying all kinds of things that some of you're hearing, some of it you're not hearing. But just the beauty of it, I think that was probably the main thing that compelled me to keep going through the motion sickness and through, life that happens, and interrupts your flight training. I had to have an ovarian cyst removed while I was trying to get my private pilot's license. So, and a lot of people say that that's why they end up quitting flying, just stuff with life gets in the way. But when that happened, I even told my doctor, I'm like, look, how fast can we do this? Because I want to get back to flying. When you decide that you really do want to do something, nothing's going to stop you.
Absolutely. That's what I have found. No matter what it is, fill in the blank. When you set your mind to it, then everything kind of works toward it. Kind of the universe looking out for you and opportunities present themselves. So it sounds like that's what happened to you, is you were just so determined that that nothing was going to stop you.
Absolutely.
From doing that. Great. Let's go back to the aerobatics.
Yes.
Why the heck would you think that might be interesting for you, and was it?
It was fascinating. You go to air shows and you see people doing all these tricks in the sky, and it literally looks like the airplane is dancing. And to me, it is a form of art. When you are in such painstakingly precise control of that airplane that you can make it do whatever you want it to do. It's a skill, it's an art, and it's, to me, especially with the aerobatics and my motion sickness, sort of requires even more concentration than just normal flying. But I wanted to know what that felt like. I wanted to know what it felt like to be upside down in the airplane, where really the only thing that's holding you is your hopefully very tight shoulder strap seatbelt. I wanted to know what it felt like to pull G's, like the Blue Angels do and stuff like that. And I would get motion sick still, and that was well into my flight training. And so, I had my license. I think at the time I was working on my instrument rating. So I had gotten over, the basic motion sickness of just being in an airplane when there's no turbulence, or, you're just kind of doing basic turns and stuff like that. But even having gotten over that, I was hoping that I would be able to get over motion sickness of doing aerobatics, and I never could fully. There were still certain maneuvers that I could do once, and then I'm like, okay, we're done for the day. And really, at most, even when I was doing the aerobatics, I could only go for about a half an hour before we had to stop. But it was in that half an hour that, you're still trying to work up to, a higher motion sickness, because clearly this is never going away with me. But I wanted to know what that stuff felt like, because it feels amazing, and so few people get to feel that.
All I can think of is why. Like, why would you want to feel that? I have a hard time on roller coasters, and I can't even imagine what it would be like, to be upside down in a plane. Like,
yeah, and I've never really liked roller coasters, and that's another thing that people think is strange. So then, wait, why would you want to do aerobatics? But it's so different, and you're in control. Or your instructor's in control, and it's an amazing feeling.
Did you ever get up to G's, as you put it, like the Blue Angels?
Yeah, well, I mean, they do a lot more G's than I could ever pull, because you have to physically work up to G tolerance. So, it helps if you're in shape. It helps if you're younger.
Well,
there's all kinds of...
explain what pulling G's means and increasing your tolerance for it.
Yeah, sure. So, here on Earth, the two of us sitting here, we're at 1 G. G is gravity. So 1 G is just the basic gravity on Earth. So when you pull G's, for example, let's say I'm just flying along straight and level, and I pull the stick back to make the airplane go straight up, then you're pulling G's because you're increasing the force of gravity on your body. And, certain planes are rated to take certain both positive and negative G's. Positive is when you're being pushed down into your seat. Negative G is when you're floating, when you're, so, and there's different things that happen to your body with positive and negative G. So, I think I worked up to maybe about, 6 positive G and a couple of negative G. Negative is way worse, because with positive G, the way you combat it, so let's say I'm flying along straight and level and I pull the airplane to go straight up. You can tense all the muscles in your lower body. So pretty much from like your butt down, you try to tense your calves and your thighs and your butt.
It's something you do purposefully.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. That pushes the blood up from your lower body, and it keeps the blood in your head, because the danger of pulling positive G is that the blood rushes out of your head and you can pass out. And you'll see that if you watch YouTube videos of the Blue Angels taking, news reporters for a flight. They'll pull positive G, the reporter in back passes out from the blood draining out of their head.
Because they haven't built up the tolerance for it.
Right.
Interesting.
Right. And the ones who do real heavy aerobatics will wear what's called a G suit, and that squeezes your lower muscles for you. Unfortunately, when you're doing negative G and the blood is all rushing to your head, there's really kind of no way to combat that. You can kind of tense the muscles in your neck just a little bit to try to keep it from flowing all into your head. But when I was pulling negative G, I never really could get used to that very well. It feels like your head is going to explode.
How did you choose your particular plane? And your plane has a name.
It does have a name. And so I'll talk about how I chose the plane first, and then I'll get to the plane's name. I was looking, so for the first 10 years of plane ownership, I owned a single-engine plane, what's called a Cessna 172. It's a four-seater. It's a very popular airplane. It's been made for decades, and very reliable. So it was perfect for me starting out. I made all kinds of trips in it. I went up to Oshkosh, Wisconsin. I actually bought it when I was living in California, so I flew it back home here to New Orleans when I moved home. It's been in the Bahamas, so it literally has been from coast to coast, and a little more than that. But I was ready for something faster and something bigger. Like I said, the whole comparison to a drug. So I was looking around for a twin-engine plane, and I was looking at Barons just because I had flown in a Baron before and I knew a little bit about it. So I went to my airport, Lakefront Airport, and looked around in all the hangars and wrote down the tail numbers of the airplane so I could look up. There's a database when you can look up an airplane owner from its tail number. So I could call around and ask, hey, are you selling your Baron anytime soon? I'm interested in buying it. And I called a friend from the airport, and I asked him. He's one of these people who knows everybody, so I knew that if there was a Baron for sale, he'd know about it. So I called him, and I said, hey, do you know of any Barons for sale? And he said, well, I think I might. Let me think about it. But he's like, where you keep your Cessna, there's that Seneca in the hangar that's for sale. And I didn't even know what a Seneca was. I've heard of it, but you don't really pay attention. There's so many makes and models of airplanes. So I kind of just ignored what he said, still just focused on the whole Baron thing. And he said, no, you really should look up the Seneca. And the next day I went back out to the airport to kind of look around some more in case some of the airplanes were gone, when I had been out there the first time. And I noticed this plane in the hangar, and purple is my favorite color. And this airplane was there, and it had, it was mostly white, but it had this kind of big purple stripe on it, a sort of a purple paint scheme. I'm like, oh, that's really cool. I love that. And I wrote down the tail number to look up what it was, because I knew, I didn't know what it was. It wasn't a Baron, obviously, because I totally ignored it before. So I went home and I looked it up, and it said it was a Piper Seneca. I don't know anything about that. I don't know what that is. I'm still going to get a Baron. So I keep looking for Barons. Well, one of my friends said the same thing. Erin, that Seneca, they're so similar. You should really consider getting that Seneca. I know you've seen it. It's right where you keep your Cessna. You probably see it every day. And whatever, why are they trying to talk me into this? And I still hadn't made the connection that was the plane that they were talking about until one of them said, here's the number of the guy who's taking care of it for the owner, because the owner hadn't been able to fly it. And like I was saying, engines don't like to sit around, so he had a mechanic flying it once in a while just to keep it running. And I called the mechanic, and he's telling me about the plane, and yeah, it sounds great, but I am just still so focused on a Baron, until at the end of the conversation, he said, Erin, it's that purple one that's sitting right by your Cessna. And I'm like, oh, wait, that's the one that I had my eye on. And it was actually, at the time, it was at a really good price because they had lost the maintenance logbooks in Hurricane Katrina. And when an airplane doesn't have full maintenance logbooks, it sort of comes at a discounted price because you can't prove the history. But the serendipity of that is that my very trusted mechanic, and, if you like your mechanic, you trust him with your life. So he's my very trusted mechanic, was the mechanic for that airplane. So he knew the history of the airplane. So, and still the resale value, if I ever plan to resell it, which I don't, is still going to be lower than what the plane is really worth. But having him, who, obviously I trust, tell me, hey, Erin, that's a great airplane. And he said, I really think you should get it. And he said, and you need to get it now because I know that my ex-wife wants it too. So I'm like, okay, that's it, sold. And I called and bought the plane. It was like the day after Mardi Gras that I bought the plane. And so that does sort of tie into the story of how my plane got its name. I call my plane Big Chief, and there is a longer name, but I'll get to that in a second. So, when I bought it, it's a Piper Seneca. It's a 1979 Seneca 2. So I thought, okay, Seneca. Yeah, okay, that's cool. Indians. There must be some famous Seneca Indian. So I'll look that up, and I'm sure it'll be obvious when I see it. And I Googled it, and there really weren't too many famous Seneca Indians, and one of them, his name was like Kornhauser or something. I'm like, I'm not naming my plane Korn something. It just doesn't fit the airplane. So I'm like, okay, and the Seneca Indians, they were way up north. They were upstate New York, Canada area. I'm like, that has nothing to do with down here. So I started trying to think of Indians from down here. And we do have some Indian tribes. That's why we have some very strange named streets like Chapatulas. Those are Indian names. But I thought, they don't really have anything personal to me. And then it hit me. Mardi Gras Indians. And if you don't know what a Mardi Gras Indian is, do yourself a favor and look it up, because it's a very rich culture. And it's a cool part of history in New Orleans. And unfortunately, it did used to be a bit of a violent history, but just since the 70s, it's now turned to more admiration for each other. The Mardi Gras Indians are groups of people, usually grouped by neighborhood here in New Orleans, and they make these elaborate costumes for 2 days during the year, Mardi Gras and Super Sunday.
But they spend all year making them.
They spend all year, literally. They will start the day after Mardi Gras making their costume for the next year. And so it's a pleasure to see these costumes. It's so cool to see them down on the street, because you don't know where they're going to be. They kind of roam around their neighborhood looking for other tribes. And so when you do run into them, you're like, oh my God, that's so cool to see them on the street. And I've always admired the Mardi Gras Indians. You do if you're from New Orleans. It's just kind of part of the culture. And so I thought, okay, well, yeah, Mardi Gras Indians. All right. So obviously, if my plane were going to be in a Mardi Gras Indian tribe, he would be the Big Chief.
Sure.
All right. But then I wanted a full Mardi Gras Indian name. And, we have like kind of some examples like Big Chief Monk Boudreaux, or Tootie Montana, so they have these kind of cool names, and it's always two names after the Big Chief. And because of the difference in fuel consumption between this new twin-engine plane that I just bought and my Cessna single engine, it was obvious when I thought, okay, full Mardi Gras name, Big Chief Gas Guzzler, or just Big Chief for short.
Yeah, Big Chief. Yeah, that's great.
And it's so funny because so many people now around New Orleans, I'm friends with a lot of the local air traffic controllers, know that my plane is named Big Chief. I'll call them up with my tail number, because that's the proper way to address air traffic control. And they'll just come back with Big Chief instead of my tail number.
With it being registered somewhere, is it registered as Big Chief Gas Guzzler, or is it just Big Chief?
No, unfortunately, the registration just is the tail number and then my name. It's all very official.
Okay.
But everybody here knows.
What's the lifespan of a plane? Like you mentioned, this was a 1979?
This is a 79, yeah. And, from especially the big manufacturers that kind of figured out how to make very reliable planes, you can still have a plane flying from, let's say, like the 50s. And, another good example is during the war, when they were making very hardy and structurally sound planes for obvious reasons. Some of those are still around. I'm in this group that flies World War II planes. So, you have a well-made airplane and it'll last forever. You do have to replace the engine. You have to replace some parts, but the airframe itself, if it was, well-made, it'll last a really long time.
Right, as long as you've got your good mechanic and you're taking care of it. Yeah.
Yes.
So let's go back a little bit and talk a little bit about your childhood and your interest in travel and flying, and kind of when that developed. Is that something very early on that you just thought, do you see a plane when you're 8 years old in the sky and you want to fly, or how did that come about?
Yeah, the travel did start very early on. When I was, I think I was 5, when my parents used to own a toy store. So my brother, who's 5 years older than I am, grew up in the toy store, which I can imagine was super cool. but I don't really remember it. When I was 5, the toy store went out of business, and, they had put all their money into it. And so, we weren't well off for quite a while. My father is an audiologist, an ear doctor, PhD. And, he was working at a hospital, but they were really trying to make this toy store thing work. And obviously it didn't. So then he was also in the process of starting his own practice. So, we were by no means rich at that time, and yet my parents knew the importance of travel. And I think a lot of people don't appreciate that. They would take us out of school sometimes to go traveling. And, when I was young, it was just what we could afford, which is taking a family van, to the west, like the Grand Canyon and stuff like that, which, it may as well be another planet, as different as it looks from here in New Orleans. And so, the appreciation of travel was instilled very young. And then as I got older and my father was doing better with his practice, then we started going to Europe every summer. And it was that love of travel that was one of the main things that spurred me on to become a pilot as well, because there are so many places that you can go that are accessible by commercial airliner. But there's an entire world that opens up places that are not accessible by commercial airliner that have just a tiny little airstrip. And it literally does open up a whole new world and millions more options of places to go. And I'm the kind of traveler now who prefers smaller, out-of-the-way places than big cities. And so to me, that was perfect, to be able to fly to places that are not accessible by commercial airliner where everybody else is going. I want to see the stuff that, not everybody gets to see. And that really was perfect, and that came from traveling as a kid.
A lot of people have a love for travel, but it never occurs to them that that they want to be a pilot. So how did you identify? Because you said that it was really just later that you thought, okay, now that I know that I can travel to Europe on a commercial flight, but I really want to get off the beaten path, and so I want to have my own plane and my own transport for that. So how is that leap, and why did you have that when I have a love for travel, but it would never occur to me to want to be a pilot? So can we dig into that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, that was actually back to the boyfriend at the time. He was telling me about the places that he would fly to. And I'm like, I have never heard of that. Where the hell is that? But it was that, and realizing like, oh, okay. And he'd tell me like something that he saw there. Like, okay, that's pretty cool. I want to go there. How do I do that? It was sort of knowing a pilot well enough that you could hear their stories and sort of the nitty gritty of the stuff that they were working on that made me realize like, this could be a really cool way for me to see the kind of stuff that I like to see.
So it was an early love of travel, and then it was a later recognition that, oh, look, there's happiness here. There's an interesting level of happiness here, and there's the ability to really get off the beaten path that made you think like that this is a possibility to be a pilot and to have more control over where you're going.
Yeah, and also, there are a lot of pilots who get their license and never really go anywhere. And, mind you, owning an airplane does make it easier than having to rent an airplane, and, you have to get on the scheduling system and pay the money and all that kind of stuff. Not that I'm not paying the money owning the airplane, but it just makes it a lot easier. You can use it as an excuse. Well, I do have to run the engine, so I really should go somewhere.
I should go get that hamburger in Key West
Exactly.
that I've always heard about.
Exactly. And among pilots, there's the expression $100 hamburger, and that's like when you just say like, hey, I'm just going to go get lunch somewhere, maybe an hour flight. Now, mind you, the expression was a long time ago, invented a long time ago, back when it used to only cost $100. Now for, an hour of a plane rental plus the fuel and all that kind of stuff, it's quite a bit more than that. But yeah, I mean, it really just, it opened me up to the possibility of traveling to the places that I prefer to travel. And also, once you get your license, and if you're bold enough to go along with the theme of this podcast, you'll kind of just look for a new place to go, just as an excuse to go someplace I've never been before. Some people collect passport stamps, which I do too. But as a pilot, you can also collect new airports listed in your logbook. And I love that. And I love, airports have cool names sometimes, and writing that in my logbook. And, because your logbook as a pilot really is sort of like a diary of your life as a pilot. And so I'll add stuff in the remarks section about who I took and what we did, not just about the flight itself. I mean, I want to remember why I did that flight. So it does give you so much more possibility as a traveler. And, I think since a very young age, I've considered myself a traveler. And being a pilot now makes me even so much more of a traveler.
It's my understanding that, it's about 5% of pilots, people with pilot license around the world, about 5% are women. Is that correct?
That
right?
is correct. And unfortunately, that percentage has not changed even since the early days in aviation. Amelia Earhart was one of the founding members of this group of women pilots called the 99s. And it's called the 99s because back when they formed it, they invited every licensed woman pilot from around the world. And, of course, some couldn't make it. But 99 pilots showed up, and so they called it the 99s. And back then, the percentage of women pilots of all licensed pilots was 5%. And unfortunately, it is still the same today.
Why do you think that is?
I think there are a lot of reasons. As women, some of us are involved in starting a family or, especially now these days, starting a career. But also, back then, most women just couldn't fly, didn't have the money, or weren't allowed to. And then also there's men going through the military. At that time, most of the pilots, starting with the airlines, were ex-military pilots. So there are a lot of facets of history that go into that percentage. And it is improving. It is slowly improving now. But it's been that same way for decades.
When you say they weren't allowed to fly, were there actually rules around it? Where they were not allowed to?
Some countries did have rules. There was a famous woman pilot, Bessie Coleman, who was black. And in the United States, they would not allow her to fly. She had to go to France, had to learn a new language to be allowed to fly.
To learn to fly, or just to fly to be a pilot somewhere?
I'm not sure exactly, but I think it was because she was black and a woman, kind of two strikes against her, and no one here would teach her, so she had to go to France.
That's crazy. It's not so crazy when you think, and because you and I are runners also, that women, there was a time not too long ago where women weren't allowed to run marathons because
exactly.
it was thought that we just couldn't do it,
right?
Like physically, that it was impossible. And there's lots of things that people believe we can't do.
Exactly.
You must have had some interesting experiences over the years as a female, being only part of 5%. Can you talk about some of the maybe challenges that have happened? Maybe a story or two about just things the walls that you've hit or challenges that you've had as a female?
Yeah, right when I started taking lessons, I had taken a couple of lessons here in New Orleans, didn't like my instructor, and it was right at the same time that I was moving to San Francisco. And when I moved there, I had a recommendation for an instructor. And he was a lifelong pilot. His father was a pilot, so he has this great history as a pilot. And I'm really thinking that this is just going to be perfect. Everything's going to be awesome. And I go on my first lesson with him, and he's even kind of cute, so there's that. And this is, we're flying around San Francisco airspace. And there's a lot of complicated airspace around there because you have SFO, you have Oakland, San Jose, and then all the smaller airports, like the ones I fly out of. So there's a lot going on. The radio chatter is always very, very busy. And so we were flying back from the East Bay back to an airport down the peninsula south of San Francisco. So we're on with NorCal Approach, which is the controlling agency for Northern California. And this professional woman pilot comes on the radio, and she announces herself very professionally, very standard radio calls, with her airline and her flight number and where she was and where she was landing. Very professional. And she ended her transmission with the word heavy, which means that she's flying a really big airplane, like a 777, 767, big airplane. My instructor, when she finished her transmission, he said, "Well, there goes another empty kitchen." And I paused because I thought, that sounded really bad, but maybe it's some pilot expression. I didn't really know what to make of it. This is my first lesson with him. So,
is it just the two of you?
Just the two of us. So I kind of looked over at him to try to gauge the look on him to see if I could figure out what that meant. And I still didn't get it. So I said, "What does that mean? Is that some kind of pilot thing?" And he said, well, it's what male pilots say in the cockpit when they hear some chick pilot come on the radio, because it means she's flying instead of being in the kitchen where she belongs.
Jesus.
And I was speechless, and I'm very rarely speechless, because here I am, a woman,
right,
and I'm paying him a lot of money to teach me how to fly. And he says this right to my face.
But because you weren't a commercial pilot yet,
right,
and you weren't out of the kitchen technically, yet. Oh my
I guess I was sort of working my way out of the kitchen, but I wasn't there yet.
So that kind of thing, you just have to suck it up, don't you?
You do, and you'll hear stories like that from every woman pilot. They've encountered that. But fortunately, there are so many more male pilots who are supportive of it. So it's not, I'm definitely not saying that that's the norm, but you will inevitably encounter somebody like that.
And he was an older pilot, or?
Yeah, sort of mid 40s. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So he wasn't 60-something, kind of growing up in a different era.
No.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Do you come across that kind of attitude a lot?
Not a lot, but it is definitely always there somewhere.
How do you handle that? Are you able to laugh that off, or does it just make you angry?
It doesn't make me angry because I know it's not personal. And, obviously an airplane does not know if you're a male or a female. And that's always, to me, what I come back to if they say something and it bothers me in any way. But it usually doesn't bother me because I will usually use it as motivation. And, unfortunately, we're still in an age where women are not accepted in many, many professions or many hobbies. Because of that, women kind of have to be better, or at least try to be better than the guys just to be accepted. And so when I hear something like that, I use it as motivation to be better. Or, well, I'm going to show him. Even if I never see him again, I'm still going to show him in my mind, that we can do this and we can do it very well.
I've heard that same thing from minorities as well. Do you, and it just, as I'm thinking this through, do you know any minority women pilots?
Plenty, yeah. There's actually there's a Facebook group of women pilots, and it's international. There are thousands of members, and so, yeah, you'll know somebody who's a minority woman pilot.
The thing that I find really impressive is the fact that you can not take it personally, especially when it's just the two of you in a plane. It would make me angry. I think I would have a difficult time, and that's just me, right? But I think I would have a difficult time not responding or reacting to it, or trying to not put him in his place, but just trying to enlighten him about how wrong that statement is. And you don't get that. You just think, nope, I'm here to do my job and to move forward with the task at hand.
Yeah, I mean, you try to have a really good comeback, but you don't always have those in your mind quickly enough. You'll think of it later that night or something. But, usually if I get a snarky comment, I have something pretty good to say back that at least will surprise them that I had, the boldness to say something back to them like that. Or, or even like I said, if you never see him again, you just use it as motivation and you just keep going and that you're a good pilot or at least can do more than he can do or whatever, and you just use it and just keep going.
Do you have the ability to teach others to fly? Or is that a whole nother certificate?
It is another certificate, and a lot of people have said that I should get it, but I really have no desire to. I taught music lessons for a while when I was in college. And I'm not the best teacher. I don't have enough patience for it.
Okay.
And that was, when they weren't trying to kill me in an airplane. I just can't imagine, being in an airplane and having a student do something really stupid.
Because I think you would be a great mentor to other women, potential women pilots.
Yeah, I mean, I am happy to be a mentor, and I have been. I try to get really anybody involved in aviation, men and women, but I am kind of biased towards getting more women involved. But they don't want me teaching them.
Yeah. I have to say that coming into this conversation, and you and I have been in touch a number of times over the years, and I think even a couple of years ago or a year ago, you had extended an invite, like, when you're down in New Orleans, let's go for a flight. And I just think a little tiny plane, no, that's like too intimidating for me. That's scary. Like I said, I'm a little bit afraid of small planes. But you've made it sound so safe. You've put a different spin on it that is making me think differently about it. So next time I come down here, I'm definitely going to give you a heads up on that, and we'll talk about going for a flight, which would be a really interesting experience for me. So thank you for kind of deconstructing that. And that actually reminds me of a story that's on your website about the gentleman, Gary, who was afraid of flying. Talk about that story a little bit, and then also talk about how you made him comfortable with really introducing him to things and explaining everything to him, and how that evolved.
Yeah, so Gary is a friend of mine. We're in a parrot head group together. Parrot heads, in case you don't know, are fans of Jimmy Buffett. And they're local groups all over the world, actually, and we have one here in New Orleans. And you become like family, so you see these people, usually once or twice a month. And so we've been friends for years, and everybody in the group knows that I'm the pilot. And ever since we met, he had said, I haven't been flying in a really long time. I went flying once 30 years ago because I had to for my job. And he said, I was just absolutely terrified. I wrote my wife that I love her. He thought he was going to die. And it was a short flight. It was from New Orleans to Shreveport in northern Louisiana. So it wasn't even a long flight or anything. But that fear of flying had kept him from flying for 30 years. And his wife, she's flown over the years for work or whatever, but doesn't get too much because he doesn't want to. And so they're sort of limited to taking vacations only on cruise ship. And she wanted to have more possibilities for vacation. So she had been begging me to take him flying. And I told her, I'd be happy to, but I'm not going to take him flying unless he wants to come flying. I'm never going to force somebody to come flying. And even he kept saying, I really should try it again. And if I'm ever going to do it with anybody, it'll be with you. But still, I wasn't going to push him. We'd kind of talk about it every time we had a parrot head meeting. And even through, I'd say maybe 2 or 3 years, I was starting to wonder, is he really going to do it? Or, we just going to talk about it for years? And so finally, I just started asking him once in a while when I had some time to do like a short flight, because you only want to take somebody for a short flight in that situation just to get them used to it. And so I'd say, hey, I have a free afternoon. Do you want to come flying? And our schedules just kind of weren't working out. Well, finally, one time, I ran it by his wife first to see if they were going to be in town that weekend and if they were going to be free. And she said, yes, please invite him. So I said, okay, well, I know I probably shouldn't do it like a week out, which was when I was contacting her, because then he'd have the whole week to fret about it. So I said, what do you think? Maybe I should text him on Friday. So the flight was going to be on Sunday. She said, yeah, that sounds good. He should, hopefully he won't get too worked up from Friday to Sunday afternoon. So I texted him on a Friday and asked, did he want to come flying? He didn't know that I had been talking to his wife yet. And he said, okay. And I was kind of surprised that he said okay. And then he texted later and he said, I'm already getting nervous. And I said, I know you are, and that's okay. But, we're gonna talk through it. So there's certain things you can kind of do to make people who are afraid of flying a bit more comfortable. And one of those things that I use most often is just to, before you go flying, just stand by the airplane, you walk around the airplane, you move things that move, you explain to them what they do, and, things that you check and why you're checking it. And then even once you get in the airplane, and you're going through your checklist to, before you taxi, you're explaining why you're doing it. Because I feel like people, when they understand more about it, it becomes less of a fear when you understand it better. So that's the option that I use the most. Otherwise, you just kind of have to feel it out by the person. Like, what exactly is it that they're afraid of with the flying? So I told him, I said, look, when you get to the airport, I'm going to come pick y'all up at the terminal. We're going to walk around the airplane. I'll tell you how stuff works. That usually helps, and it'll calm you down. Well, I taxied from my hangar over to the terminal, and I could kind of tell they were a bit worked up. And his wife had texted me while I was taxiing that, we're here, and he's okay, but he's pretty nervous. So when I went over to them, I could kind of tell that he was pretty nervous. So I said, look, I'm going to leave it up to you. Do you want to just go and get it over with? Or do you want me to walk around and explain things so you understand it better? He said, no, let's go. Okay, so now I know that time is of the essence. So, I try to get his wife in the back as quickly as I can, get her comfortable, and then go in the front with him. I let him sit next to me. And I'm explaining things, but I'm kind of going through it, as quickly as I can, because I know that just the longer it goes, the more he's going to get worked up. We take off. We're going to do just a little city tour. And usually if I'm taking somebody on a city tour, like if I took you, we'd do maybe 2 or 3 loops around the city, because there's so much to point out, and sometimes it's kind of hard to get your bearings. For you, I know where I am, but, I'm pointing everything out, and there's just so much in New Orleans to point out that I'll usually do 2 or 3 laps around the city. But I told him, I said, look, we'll do 1 loop. I'll ask you how you're feeling, see if you're doing okay. And if you want, we can do another loop. And if not, we go straight back to the airport. So you don't want to push it, So we got going, and I'm kind of glancing over at him out of the corner of my eye, and I can see he's okay. You can hear him breathing through the headset. So, it's not perfect, but, I think he's handling it pretty well. And then even after a couple of minutes, he starts taking pictures, and that's a good thing to focus on. You're doing a task. And so we make 1 loop around the city, and I said, okay, how are you doing? Or are you doing okay? Do you want to go for another loop? He said, I'm okay, but I'm also ready to go back to the airport. I'm like, okay, fair enough. I mean, because he did
knew
it.
his limit.
That's all it took. And so as soon as I landed and taxied off the runway where I can stop and, do things with radios or whatever if I need to, as soon as I got off the runway, I stopped and I turned to him and I put my hand on his leg and I patted his leg and I said, you did it. And he even looked surprised that I said that. He looked over at me and I think it only hit him then that he really had done it. And then the look on his face changed from nervousness and fear and just, I guess, facing the unknown to like, you could see how proud he was.
Yeah, accomplishment.
And it was the greatest look. And to me, that's such a reward for me. And not only that, when somebody enjoys a flight, that's enough. But literally for him and for his wife, and they've said this so many times since the flight, that I've changed their lives. And, how often can you say that you've actually changed somebody's life? And for that, it really only took, a pre-flight of, 20 minutes and then taxiing over to the terminal, maybe an hour total. And then we had lunch after so we could kind of talk about it. And
so it probably showed him a couple of things that not only that he could fly and kind of change his thinking around it, but then what else is he limiting himself to in other areas of his life where he could maybe get over a hurdle with something else?
Right, exactly. And even since that flight, and we were maybe in the air for 7 minutes total. I'm talking short flight to change somebody's life that much. They took a commercial flight to Houston and they had a little short weekend vacation in Houston. They sent me pictures from there. And they're already planning a longer trip. So that is like the coolest reward for me.
Yeah. And I'm sure because his wife had this desire to travel previously and fly somewhere, I'm sure it's been a great thing for her to be able to kind of
they both
live
send me
another
texts
life.
And just they're still thanking me to this day.
Oh,
and
that's sweet.
That's just the awesomest thing.
Well, first, as we kind of wrap up here, is there anything that we didn't cover that you'd like to add?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think we've pretty much covered all the good stuff.
Okay, yeah, we have definitely. There's been a lot of great stuff here for sure. What is it to you, like when you think of being bold? What does that mean to you? What is it? How do you observe that in other people or in yourself? What does that mean, being bold?
I think just trying new things, doing something that either will change your life or maybe even just change your perspective. Learning a new skill, learning a new language, just being different. We weren't born to just sit around and do our jobs and not go anywhere, not see anything, not do anything. So, and that's why I like to fly. It gives me travel. It gives me relaxation. It gives me something to concentrate about. So it keeps my mind active. To me, that kind of stuff, just living a full life. That's boldness.
What is living a full life? Now, you mentioned doing something different, but you don't mean doing something different from someone else, doing something different than what you would expect of yourself.
Well, think of how big this world is and how many different things there are to do and to see. To me, that's living a full life, is trying to do as much as you can and see as much as you can. And that's why travel is so important to me, because, it makes you appreciate how well we have it. Or even if you don't have such a great life, you're still better off than so many other people in the world. And I often even tell people I kind of need that reminder, like if I'm having a really bad time at work or something, or something's really bothering me, I need travel as a reminder that, hey, I have a really good life and I have no right to complain about anything. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a good lesson, to have that and to see that and to realize like, hey, it's pretty good. I have it pretty good. So
How old are
chill
you?
out. I'm 37.
Oh,
Just had
wow.
a birthday
Okay,
last
great.
week.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Yeah. Happy birthday. I saw that on Facebook. The teller of all things.
Yes.
What would you say to someone who, and you're young. What would you say to someone who's maybe older listening to this podcast? And I don't know how old Gary is, but maybe he's an older gentleman. What would you say to someone who not has given up, but just isn't as interested in pursuing things or trying to find different things to do? Like, how do you get out of that funk? How do you find those things?
I think we all do go through funks, different stuff, relationships or work or money or whatever. That's just part of life. But I guess I've never really even needed motivation to look around for something to do. I just get bored sitting around and not doing anything. But I have people come to me sometimes, like say older people, who say, I always wanted to learn how to fly, but I was starting a family, or I was starting a new job, or I was moving. There's so many excuses to not have, like I said, the time and the money to fly, and that's perfectly okay. But then they say, I'm too old now. And I'm like, no, you're not. I just read just last week about somebody who started taking flying lessons at the age of 90. There's really, now, this day and age, there's no such thing as being too old for something. You can find some way to do it if you really want to do it. Or a lot of people say, well, my eyesight's bad, so I can't fly. And that's a common misconception. I used to wear very thick glasses and contacts, and I had LASIK, so I don't need those anymore, but I still flew, So there's so many possibilities. Or even if, let's say you have some physical disability that does not allow you to fly. Meet some pilots, go to your local airport, go around, tell them, hey, I really, really would love to fly. Is there somebody who could take me flying? And pilots are always happy to take somebody who wants to go flying, and I love it when people ask me, hey, my son or my cousin or whoever, he's always wanted to fly. He's 12 years old, whatever, kid or not kid, I'll take anybody flying.
That's great to know.
If it's something that you want to do, just go to where it happens and ask around, and you'll make new friends, you'll meet new people, and you'll probably get a chance to do it.
That's a really good tip there. Just ask for what you want.
Exactly.
For sure, and you never know what might present itself. When did you start running? It doesn't sound like that was something that you started when you were 15 or when you were in high school or grade school.
No, I didn't. I started running, I think the first time that I tried it, I want to say I was about 17. And like I said, I just hated it. Especially here in New Orleans, it gets pretty hot in the summer. Yeah. So I would not really recommend starting to try running in the summer. That might sort of deter you. But and I think it was the summer that I tried running the first time and absolutely hated it. But I needed something. I needed some activity because I was having kind of lower back problems that I found if I did exercise more, they went away. So I tried running again. I think it was maybe about a year later. And for some reason, something just clicked. So I guess I was maybe 18-ish, 19-ish.
Okay, so you were still quite young when
yes.
you. Okay, I started running at in my mid 40s, and I ran
That's awesome.
I ran my first marathon at 50.
That's even more awesome.
Yeah, and so I, to get back to your point about it's never too late. I always think that it's like, yeah, if I can do something, not just learning a skill, but learning something with my body. When you think like, oh, as you get older, it gets more difficult to do these things. Really, there's no limit, and there should be nothing stopping us, whether it is learning how to fly or running or going back to school. There's all sorts of opportunities, and I think that's such an important lesson to teach people, but to also live by that example too, that there's lots of opportunities at no matter what age.
Yeah, and for running or flying or whatever it is, you'll hear these stories. Like I said, I read about a guy who started taking flying lessons when he was 90, and I think a lot of people, all it takes is hearing an example like that.
Exactly.
But then on the other hand, why not be that example? Why I can now tell people, hey, I know this lady who ran a marathon when she was 50. Like, how cool is that? So why not, instead of reading about those examples, be that example?
Yeah, I find the problem is that we often talk ourselves out of things before we allow them to come to fruition. And I think if we can learn to not negative self-talk or have that self-doubt and just catch ourselves with that way of thinking before we believe that something isn't possible. I think that's the real key, because these things are so ingrained in us. Because I thought the same thing about flying. I thought, because I think, or I was told something that if you had bad eyesight that you couldn't be a pilot. And so you latch onto something, and then it becomes your truth, and then it's never a possibility. And so if the desire to do something like what you've done, if the desire to become a pilot is so much stronger than any of the negative stuff that happens, then you just figure out a way to do it. Like the health issue that you had, you just thought, nope, I don't care about the health thing going on. I've got to get to my flying lesson, or I've got to get back up in the air as quickly as possible. You just have to develop that sense of passion or purpose or interest or whatever that is, that motivation that gets you through that and gets you to that point where you can complete something.
Definitely.
Erin, oh my gosh, this was just fantastic. I so appreciate your time today, and I thank you for coming down into the French Quarter while I'm here this week so that we could chat, because I've learned a ton, and it's been great to get to know you as well. We've been trying to link up for a while, and we've been longtime Facebook friends. It's always fun to meet people in person, so thanks so much for coming today.
Thank you. This was a huge honor. Thank you.
After we finished recording, I asked Erin how tall she was, and she said 4'11 and a half. She is a tiny thing. And that makes the fact that she's a pilot so much more awesome. She said she actually has to put special pillows on her seat so she can reach the pedals of the airplane. And I could see how she could just as easily talk herself out of being a pilot because of her height, but not Erin. She was pretty determined. If you check out the show notes, I'll add a photo of the two of us on there. A reminder that if you like what you hear, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play, and write a review. Those reviews really do help the podcast get more exposure and will ultimately help us grow our Be Bold community. I bet you know a few people in your world who would also enjoy today's conversation and this podcast in general, so please do share. I'm working on launching a website dedicated to the podcast, but in the meantime, you can find out more about me by visiting wanderlustandlipstick.com as well as WanderTours.com. And that's where you'll see the tours I lead around the world, as well as our culinary tours to New Orleans, Santa Fe, and also here in Seattle. It's worth mentioning that soon you'll be able to purchase Be Bold gear and accessories. I encourage you to also check out the Wonder World Foundation, the nonprofit I founded to help women and children in developing countries, and I'll put links to all those sites in the show notes as well. You can find those on wanderlustandlipstick.com/podcast. Sign up for my newsletter on the Wanderlust and Lipstick site, and you'll receive tips on making your travels more bold. You can friend me on Facebook, and I'm WanderGal on Instagram. If you know of any high-performing, adventurous, philanthropic women whom you might think would be a good guest, shoot me a note or leave a comment. And finally, the ladies can join us on our Be Bold Facebook group. That's where you'll find our growing community. It's where we share goals, talk about our setbacks, and where you can find words of encouragement and inspiration from others. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Be Bold podcast. Until next time, be bold.